Okay, everybody, welcome. My name is Fernando DeMaio. I'm one of the co-directors of the Center for Community Health Equity. It's a great privilege and honor to welcome you today and welcome our speakers. Two people who don't need an introduction because this is their house. So Myles Castro from Sinai, a recent graduate of our MPH program, who graduated from our program without ever taking a class from me.
I don't know how that happened.
So welcome back, Myles. And Dan Schober, clinical assistant professor here at our MPH program. We're going to speak today about the great work of the Chicago Gun Violence Research Collaborative, and the discussion will feature a panel discussion with some of the interviewees from this first wave of qualitative work. So welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Great, thanks for the intro, Fernando.
Sure.
Thank you for everyone for being here today. Today we're going to be talking about identifying perceptions of gun violence in the most impacted communities of Chicago. So we're going to start off with a little background about gun violence in Chicago. Then we're going to move on to talk about the Chicago Gun Violence Research Collaborative, specifically the fellowship program. Then we're going to dive into the discussion panel with our community leaders. So gun violence in Chicago. So we all know that gun violence is a major issue in Chicago, but how big of an issue is it? So per 100,000 people in Chicago, there are more homicides than New York, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia combined. In just 2016, there are over 760 homicides in Chicago, of which 90% involved a firearm. And of those homicides, about a third occurred in just 5 of the 77 communities in Chicago. And those communities were located in the west and south sides. And looking at the age distribution of homicides in Chicago, you can see that it disproportionately affects the youth, with about 45% of homicides occurring for people aged between 20 to 29, and about 20% aged between 10 and 19. And gun violence also disproportionately affects African American and disadvantaged populations. On the left, you have the racial and ethnic distribution of Chicago, and you can see Chicago's pretty diverse, with about a third being non-Hispanic Black, another third being Hispanic or Latinx, and another third being non-Hispanic White, with a small population of non-Hispanic Asian, Pacific Islander, or other. However, if you look at the distribution of homicide victims by race, you can see that almost 80% of those homicide victims are African Americans. And that's such a high amount, just even though African Americans just make up about a third of Chicago's population. Next are Hispanics at 16%, and non-Hispanic white make up only 5% of the homicide victims in Chicago. So you can start to see the racial disparities in terms of gun violence in Chicago. On the left, you have a map of firearm-related homicides, where the darkest blue indicates a higher rate of firearm-related homicides, and the lighter blue indicates the least amount of firearm-related homicides. And on the right, you have a dot density map, where each dot indicates a single person. And as you can see, Chicago's also very segregated, with non-Hispanic Black populations being found predominantly in the west and south sides, non-Hispanic white populations being focused more in the north, and Hispanic and Latinx populations on the southwest and northwest sides. And when you start to overlay those two maps together, you can start to see that a lot of these firearm-related homicides are occurring in these minority populations. Same thing for non-fatal shootings. Again, the darkest blue indicates a higher rate of non-fatal shootings, and the lightest blue indicates the least amount of non-fatal shootings. And last, we have aggravated battery with a handgun, and this is a heat map. Between 2015 and 2016, there was a 43% increase in aggravated battery with a firearm. And looking at the heat map, where you see the red to yellow to that bright white, that's the highest concentration of aggravated battery with a handgun. And as you can see, those hotspots are occurring in those minority populations. So moving on to the Chicago Gun Violence Research Collaborative, or CGVRC. The CGVRC was convened by the Sinai Urban Health Institute and the Illinois Public Health Institute. It all really began with this article written by Karen Teitelbaum, the CEO of Sinai Health Systems. And this quote really sums up this entire article on why Chicago needs a big gun violence study. Without the research that tells us the root causes of gun violence, we are just guessing, feeling our way in the dark. And that really sparked this initiative to begin the CGVRC, which is a collection of local academic researchers and community groups of more than 15 community partners. And the CGVRC has 3 work groups: a community engagement, research, and philanthropy work group.
Great. I'll talk just a little bit more about the CGVRC. The overarching goal of the CGVRC is to identify the root causes of gun violence and what works in stopping it, to collectively develop solutions to end and address the epidemic. And one of the first things that the CGVRC did was really meet collaboratively and try to develop the community engagement plan. It's also kind of referred to as a framework. And I'm just going to quickly go through what they conceptualized in terms of what they wanted to accomplish and how they wanted to do that. 4 phases. First phase was about scoping and defining. And so with this, it was really about developing a vision. It was people cross-sector at these different entities that Myles mentioned, but really trying to build a vision, and then really considering community inputs and looking for opportunities to engage a number of different researchers doing this work. In phase 2, then, we moved to implementation. And one thing to draw your attention to is that 3rd bullet. The intent was to build community capacity and to work collaboratively. And it was realizing that there's a lot of really good gun violence research happening in the city at all of our institutions, and so we wanted to really try to build upon that and not try to step over it. Phase 3 was about monitoring and tracking. Now this is a phase that really hasn't yet been realized, but I think the importance of the intent here was to really kind of get a sense of what's being accomplished. These are things like outputs that are number of community partnerships, adherence to commitments, things like that, but also some of the outcomes. So I think this is something to think about in the future. At the end of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about where the CGVRC is going, but monitoring and tracking all the accomplishments is an important part of it. And then 4th was deliverables. 2 to point out that have happened and that are starting. That 2nd bullet is about the websites. And we had a website that was developed. It provided both a list of resources, scholarly papers, and publications that really got at the issue of gun violence. So it served as kind of a reference or clearinghouse for some research. The other thing then was the CGVRC and what they were doing. It was a number of interviews and a number of different things that Sharon Holman, who was directing it at the time, had done to try to raise awareness about gun violence and try to build this kind of collaborative effort here in Chicago. The last thing I'll say, recommendations for funders down at the very bottom right-hand side there. Recommendations for funders, city government, and researchers about community-identified needs and opportunities. This is something that's currently still happening. There's currently still efforts to do some of this, to work with policymakers, to try to bring together researchers. But this is something that will continue to guide us as we go to year 2, and we'll talk more about that at the end of the presentation. I wasn't directly involved in that, but I was directly involved in the fellowship program, really through Myles here. He's an MPH student here at DePaul, as Fernando mentioned, and he asked if I would be willing to write a letter and serve as a faculty fellow. The way that the fellowship part of it worked out was that students and academic fellows from 5 different universities came together. The universities you can see on the right there: Adler, DePaul, Loyola, Rush, and UIC. And the fellowship had 16 students, 6 faculty members that oversaw them, and there were 4 different neighborhoods that we wanted to focus on: Austin, Inglewood, Garfield Park, and North Lawndale. So all 4 of those neighborhood groups had students and a faculty fellow, and we did a couple things in that time. We looked at the different sectors that relate to violence. We looked at the business sector, we looked at the educational sector, faith-based sector, and the social and community sector, and we identified a number of assets that are important to consider as we move forward. More specifically, we did a couple different things throughout the first part of the fellowship. It lasted about 6 months. You see some of the fellows on the right there. But one of the things that each of the neighborhood groups did was a risk and resiliency profile. Again, we looked at those 5 different sectors and some of the assets that exist. So we wanted to take more of an asset-based or strength-based approach as opposed to one that was dwelling on the things, the statistics that Myles brought up. We catalog these assets and also some of the opportunities. We started to take those assets and put them into a GIS database. That I think is still a work in progress, but we wanted to be able to tell a story with that. And then what we'll talk about today is some of the key informant interviews. Each of the neighborhood groups and the fellows, the student fellows led some interviews. And we want to kind of dive into that today and talk more about that here.
Yeah, Dan mentioned the last aspect was the key informant interviews. And the purpose of these interviews were to really identify community perceptions and potential solutions to gun violence in Chicago. And how we identify community leaders were through the assets we cataloged from our community organizations. And in total, we were able to conduct 15 interviews with community leaders across those 5 sectors that Dan mentioned. And we were able to interview across the 4 communities, with 4 interviews occurring in Austin, 1 in Garfield Park, 8 in Englewood, and 2 in North Lawndale. And the 9-question interview guide helped guide the fellows through the interview process, asking questions on the organization, perceptions of gun violence just not within their communities, but as Chicago as a whole, and potential solutions to stopping gun violence.
And one thing that was, one thing that was really interesting about this is we had across those 5 universities, folks that weren't social scientists, they weren't public health people, we had a few occupational therapists, we had a few art therapists. So it was a really multidisciplinary group and a great way to train them, but also for them to bring a different perspective to traditional qualitative interviewing done with community members.
So this is the initial stage of the review of the interviews. So we began looking at themes, and the themes were guided by the socio-ecological model. We're looking first at more upstream of public policy, then going down to community, organization, interpersonal, then individual. Then looking at some of the themes, I'm going to show you some examples. For example, for public policy, a common theme was gaps in the firearm regulation. And I want to read a quote real quick that for me was really inspirational. If a 12-year-old can have a gun, but yet cannot get a meal prior to school, we're missing so much. We're just missing a lot, which I think says a lot in terms of gaps in firearm regulation and public policy. Next, for community, negative messages from the media and the community was a major theme. Organization, so siloed organizations. Throughout the interviews, we found out that there are a lot of organizations doing good in terms of violence prevention. However, a lot of those organizations were siloed, and which decreased their scope of work. Interpersonal, poor social influences, and individual negative personal self-perceptions was a major theme. So for the discussion panel, we're going to look a little deeper into these themes and have a further discussion. So I want to bring up our panelists. We have Clement Martin from Christ the King Jesuit College Preparatory School. We have Philip Sipka from Kusanda Cafe in Englewood, and Christopher T. Crater at the Urban Prep Academies.
Hey y'all. That awkward moment there.
Thank you.
Nice picture too.
Thanks guys for being here today. Means a lot. So I want to let's do introductions. Name of your organization, your role within the organization, and what your organization does in the community.
So again, hello everybody. Happy Thanksgiving. My name is Christopher T. Crater. I am the Director of Community Programs for Urban Prep Academies. I oversee all the marketing, community partnerships, and admissions and recruitment stuff. And I'm also the instructor for the After School Matters Peacemaker program for our Englewood campus. So I'm at Urban Prep Academies. We're the nation's first all-boys public charter high school in the country. We have 3 campuses, one on 62nd and Stewart in Englewood, 135th and King Drive in Bronzeville, and one on 14th and Loomis in the West Loop area on the west side. And pretty much we specialize in sending young African-American males to and through college.
My name is Phil Sipka. I am the executive director of the Kusanya Cafe, which is a small cafe in Englewood. all run by all Inglewood residents, so all the board members are Inglewood residents. And we kind of exist to be a place of empowerment and encouragement to Inglewood residents. What I mean by that is just to be, our belief is that if we can just get all the different people that live in the community to come together and interact organically, we can empower each other and create change.
My name is Clem Martin. I'm the president of Christ the King Jesuit College Prep on the west side in the Austin community. So we're one of about 70 Jesuit high schools across the country, and we're also one of the Cristo Rey model schools. So there's about 35 Cristo Rey model schools across the country. What's unique about that is kind of we serve students from under-resourced communities that don't have the means to go to private high schools and may not have other educational opportunities within their community. So we have a work study model, so our kids go to work at corporate partners throughout the city, and that's how we finance their education. So we share the work study program with Cristo Rey and Pilsen, and so we have over 200 corporate partners that support our students and engage our students, provide opportunities for them. And much like Urban Prep, our goal is to kind of get kids to and through college as well.
Let's dive into this. So opening thoughts on gun violence in Chicago. Do you want to start us off?
I've been working in education. I came to Chicago 22 years ago as a volunteer teacher, and I worked in the Pilsen community back before it gentrified a bit. Kind of at 18th Street was different years ago, and it's been interesting working and living in Little Village. I lived in 27th Central Park for a long time, and the experience I had there as part of the community, and raising kids in that community, and the pressure it adds to you as a parent, and the exposure of your kids to things in the neighborhood that you'd hope you'd be able to kind of shelter them from. And then I think working on the west side, that experience is even heightened, especially over the last few years. With the spike in gun violence a couple of years ago, the impact it's had on our community. We've had issues at school. With our work study program, we transport kids to and from downtown for their jobs. And a couple of years ago, our school bus got caught in a gang crossfire where the bus driver got hit. So kids are continually exposed to stress and trauma and different things by living in these neighborhoods, and it has an impact on their social emotional health and their ability to perform academically, ability to kind of do a lot of different things. And so I see the impact daily in the work we do at school, and kind of it has not only on the kids but their parents as well and the community as a whole. And so I think it's a major issue for our student community, but for the city as a whole that needs to be solved.
It's interesting. I think when I think of gun violence, I think of it being a problem of the middle class, to be honest with you. And I believe it's based on myth. The myth that my neighborhood is scarier than other neighborhoods. The gun violence in my neighborhood makes a lot more sense to me than violence that happens in other neighborhoods. And there's violence that happens in all different neighborhoods. I'm actually more fearful of a crazy white gun than I am of anybody in my neighborhood carrying a gun, because that doesn't make sense. And I don't know, that could happen to me, but I know a lot of people in my neighborhood that wouldn't happen as much. But I think the causes of violence come more from our anxiety as a culture, middle class culture, of not wanting to be anywhere near people in neighborhoods primarily of color. So I think those maps that Myles showed earlier, I think we'd also see, if we correlated them with white flight and then later middle class black flight, they would be completely mirrored. So the fact that we don't want to live our lives anywhere near these neighborhoods, but that we just want to pump money in and hopefully they can kind of solve it on their own with just more money, I think is the major contributing factor. So I think economic, educational segregation is one of the major causes.
For me personally, growing up in North Lawndale, East Garfield Park neighborhood, I've lost several friends to gun violence, and also teaching in Inglewood at the Urban Prep Academy's Inglewood campus for 4 years. Just to give you guys a little background about Urban Prep and gun violence that's impacted our young men. We opened our doors in 2006, and since that time we've had 29 of our young men shot, 13 killed, and in the year of 2018 we've had a young man shot every month. So for us, college for some of our guys is life or death. So gun violence impacts me definitely on a day-to-day basis.
Thanks for that. So I want to move into one of our first themes, impact of the media. And so this is one of the quotes from one of our interviews. But the gun violence here, that's also been exacerbated as well. Because we have a way of controlling the narrative in this country through media, through publications. So I want to get your opinions on how gun violence is expressed through the media and its effect in these communities. And Philip, you kind of started to touch on this. So I'd like to start with you.
I don't think anybody that's wielding a gun in my neighborhood cares anything at all about what's said in the media, and I don't think that affects them in any way, on whether or not they want to shoot somebody. I would say, though, it kind of goes back to my other point. What I think it does is it exacerbates the anxieties and the fears of people ever wanting to move to those neighborhoods, and that is like an indirect problem. So yeah, are kids listening to the news and going, "Oh man, they only think I'm going to shoot somebody, so I guess I'm going to shoot somebody today"? No, they're not even listening. That's not even a primary concern at all. I think the concern is not even seeing life lived out by anyone different on the block, even when those people exist. And that's why we kind of had the organization saying, "Man, can we even get the middle class residents we have in our community come out into public so somebody can see that they live next to a guy who programs, writes programs for computers. You might not even know that option." So that would be my perception of media.
I think it drives perceptions that's not necessarily accurate. I think the idea behind a cafe is a great one because you get to know people. And I think if you get to know people in Austin or the other communities throughout the city, it's like overwhelming majority are very, very good people, hardworking people, want an opportunity, kind of looking for great things. And I think at times when the media kind of it's the same story again and again and again, you get the same perception. And so I think when a lot of people think of the West Side, I think they think, kind of poor, black, disintegrated family, like all these different things. And part of that is accurate because statistics bear that out. But I think they're missing a bigger narrative in the community of the people who actually live there, work there, and kind of a lot of the people, I'd say over 90% of the people are doing great things and looking for opportunity. And I think when you have this narrative, it drives away investment, and so from the community. And so it's hard for kids to find opportunity. And I think that's with our work study program. Kids see opportunity through corporate partnerships, and they get to see what's out there through hard work and an education that they might not see because investment has been driven out of the neighborhood for years now. So.
I think what's interesting about working with the young men, in particular, you get to see how perception plays a huge role, especially for our guys when they go to school out of state. Because a lot of the guys, that attend Mississippi State or, that might go to Georgetown or might go to, Brown, right? When they get there, they often come back to us and they talk about like, man, a lot of guys were like, asking me, have I been shot before? Or had I been shot at? And, some of these guys bought into those perceptions while they were here, but when they got out, outside of Chicago, they were like, man, people really view us like that? They really think it's bad like that? And I know from a personal standpoint, one of the reasons why I decided to leave and go to college in Mississippi down south was to get out of Chicago because, it was just too much. I'm like, man, I'm studying hearing about, the gun violence, and I'm becoming that, right? And, I was like, okay, I'm escaping. But when I got down there and, I started to see people's perception of Chicago, I'm like, well, no, it's not quite that, But of course, that's hard to tell somebody who that's all they see. So I will say, our young men and ladies right now, I think are very impacted because they're always on their phones, they're always on their computers, they're looking to see what's going on. And I think eventually, especially at a young age, when they keep saying that about a particular thing about you, eventually you start to believe it. And it might not be oh, okay, I think I'm a bad guy or I think I'm a violent guy, but subconsciously you start to, okay, well maybe I am bad, and that can be put out in some of your actions. So.
One of the stories I like to share, one of our kids was at work and somebody came up to them at one of our corporate partners, and they told the kid, and you hope it comes from a good place, but they went up to our student and said, you should be better than the people on your block. And the kid looks at him and kind of goes, well, what do you mean by that? He's like, you know what I mean, you should be better than the people on your block. He's like, well, you don't know anybody on my block, you know? And so like, who the hell are you to come up to me and kind of say, this is who I should be, or this is how I should feel, or different things like that. And that happens a lot with our kids. And so I think perception kind of what people see on the news, they envision our kids, and a lot of times they lower their expectations for our students and lower their expectations of what their abilities are. And that's just kind of one of the stories, but our kids encounter this pretty often. We had it even worse. Is like there was an older white guy came up to our kids and he's like, as a young black man, you should. And it's kind of like, as an older white person, what would you think, you know, gives you any kind of understanding of what this kid has gone through, and what gives you kind of like the privilege or kind of like to step up to our kids, say this is what you should do and this is who you should be, kind of. And all those things, you hope it comes from a good place where kids want to, like an adult wants to engage, kind of learn something or do something or help. But the reality is, it's kind of, when some of that perception is, you know, kind of internalized by a lot of people who don't live or understand the community, and then that's how they approach the community. So.
Those are some great examples about lived experience versus told experience. So with that, do you think there's some responsibility for the media to uphold? And is there any way we can improve these messages that the media is depicting?
So it's like, I think, and I'm sure like working out of high school too, like in terms of like major media, like our kids aren't paying attention to that. Like it's more the social media and kind of their connections with friends and kind of a lot of that interaction, like in terms of our student perception and understanding of kind of how the world works and how they get their news stream and the different pieces there. So I think it's more the adults in terms of the like the media where you see on the TV and kind of things like that. It's like who's watching and who's engaging in that kind of media. But for our students, it's more like the social media and how they engage on a lot of different levels and kind of how they understand issues at times.
Same for our guys. Yeah. You know, I mean, I would hope that, I mean, because I know our coverage is exclusive, you know, like, you know, we have a young man killed in the city, you know, every news crew in the country, well, in our city is there, because they, you know, it's this, you know, bright kid that was going to college. You know, we feel so bad, but you know, what about the other 6 or 7 kids that got shot last night too? You know, and you know, did we, you know, did the media show up for them? You know, did they go talk to them? Because we had one student, Mr. Fields, who was shot and killed 2 days in a summer vacation in 2016. He would have graduated 2018 in May, and I'll never forget. You know, the crisis team was there. Because you know the students were out, but they wound up coming back to the school, and they were like, well, you know, we can't stay long because you know 3 other, you know, young people got shot and killed that weekend too, but you know we didn't see that media coverage. So it's interesting. You know, I definitely think you know if it bleeds, it leads sometimes, and I wish there was more on an equal plane, I guess, when we're talking about the media portrayal. So.
Do you have any sense of what the narrative is on social media?
Well, for the last few years, I think it's been Chirac. You know, I think from 2008 to 2012, and I was telling, you know, Dr. Dan, you know, so I graduated from high school in 2007, and 2012, I came back and didn't recognize Chicago. Now again, you know, Chicago early 2000s, a lot of stuff went on. I saw a lot of stuff. But it was a little different though. I feel like 2008 to 2012, they were able to hone in on this Chirac thing. And this Chirac thing got so big that a lot of our young people were like, man, yeah, we from Chirac. You know, like it gave the guys who don't have a sense of home or a sense of family, like, okay, well, we can be a part of this family, right? Like we're hard, we're tough, we're angry, you know, which are all narratives that aren't necessarily true, but those are mainstream through, I think the biggest social media portrayals about us as African-American males are that we're angry, we're violent, and we're uneducated. And that's one of the things that we've been trying to depict these last few years.
I would say, I think I would always echo what these two gentlemen were saying, and I think, yeah, I still think boots on the ground things will make people feel like they're not worth anything. When it gives a damn what it says in the Tribune or the Sun-Times, you see disinvestment around you. That you know, that's what tells you. You walk into a store with bars in the windows. That tells you how you're perceived and how you're valued. I was shocked when I was talking to a couple of my coworkers When I wanted to listen to the Van Dyke verdict on the radio in the cafe, and people were like, "Who's this?" I said, "Oh, you know, Laquan McDonald." I'm like, "Who's what? I don't remember that." Like, there is still a disconnect. There's a major disconnect, I think, that we're not realizing, and I think there's lack of nuance. Just to get to the point, like, we will spend infinite amounts of time in the media questioning why a white person shot anybody, and going to like, man, what happened here? And I think there's more of course, black teens shoot each other. You know, I think there's a little bit of there's less of a nuance, and that just keeps perpetuating this thing. And I even read a Harvard study that said something that scared me. It said no neighborhood that's over 40% African American ever gentrifies. And like that to me shows what some of the problems are, because of this perception in the media potentially is causing people's harm. So I'm scared of that neighborhood, you know.
I want to move forward with this negative messages and potentially negative personal self-perceptions. And here's a quote from one of our interviews. But the reality is that like some of these schools, there's 78 graders and only 20 of them are graduating. 20 out of 70. Why is that? Because in their minds, they're being told, well, you're not going to do anything anyway. You're not even going to get through high school. Clem, you started talking about negative self-perceptions. Would you want to start?
Sure, like, again, I think with our kids, like the kids that are coming to our school, I think they realize there's challenges out there in terms of their academic success, but I don't think they come with the perception that they're not going to be successful. I think there's a lot of obstacles, and I think trying to instill that grit and persistence as obstacles come up and things come up in their lives, how to persist through different things is always challenging. But in terms of this quote, like I see, and I think a lot of schools do this, and I think Urban Prep does, I think a lot of good schools do, is kind of really looking at social emotional health too, and kind of self-esteem, and you see more and more schools engaging on that level to make sure you're building up those things as well, just instead of just your math score and your reading score, because I think it's an important component of education and kind of what we're doing in our schools is kind of that whole social emotional health and creating positive self-image. And I think a lot more schools are paying more attention to that. So, like when I read that quote, I was kind of looking at that. And I think you look at, in terms of working at a high school, you look at a lot more college graduation rates for our kids. And I think more and more kids in Chicago are graduating from high school. And whether those numbers are accurate or not, kind of, you know, and who's provided is always interesting. But I think you see that high school is becoming more of, like more and more kids are graduating. So I think those numbers are kind of shocking, the ones when I read those in the quote. So.
I'm probably the least qualified person here to answer this question on these two gentlemen, but I think they're not perceptions. I think some people are basing things on reality and what they see around them, and I'm going to keep beating the same drum. I mean, if our schools are rough, it's because all of our middle-class parents are scared to put their kids in public schools. That there's an infinite amount of, there's a finite amount of resources that we have. And you cannot replace, you know, I think we're asking too much of teachers, we're asking too much of schools, doesn't matter how much money you give them. If you take all the kids from very, very stable homes out of every school, and then you go, okay, now teach the rest. Like, you're gonna struggle. To me, it's not a resource issue, it's not even a perception issue. It's the fact that you've done what you've done economically with these neighborhoods. We've skimmed off all the top, and then they say, all right, y'all, you know, like, why are you screwing up? Like, why are you so messed up now? And we've strip mined. We've strip mined our schools, and then we've asked the teachers to do the same job without my limited experience in education. You know, when you have a certain percentage of kids that are coming from very chaotic backgrounds, it's almost impossible to be able to coach that self-perception to that group. But if you have just enough, just a few, you can lean on those kids from great homes, and then they will bring everybody else up. But if everybody is in this very this mentality of scarcity, and we got to get the best for our kids, and if it's not the best, then we're doing them a disservice. And I think like that lack of communal thinking it's destroying us.
So I would say, personally, for me, being in this position, where I get to kind of review admissions and recruitment stuff, this year I was like, you know what, I want to go back to my elementary school. So I graduated from 8th grade, 2003. I want to go back this year. I haven't been back since. And about a month ago I went, me and my assistants, we went to the campus, and my gym teacher, who had been there 25 years, he's still there. My kindergarten teacher's still there. And my gym teacher, he cried like when he saw me. And my assistant, who's from the South Side, was like, man, like, it seems like they're very attached to you. Like what, like what is it? Like what happened? And one of the things I was telling them was like, man, a lot of my classmates are gone now. I just turned 30 in August, and in North Lawndale and East Garfield Park, that's like being 65 for an African American male. It just doesn't happen, right? So to, be at that school, to have those conversations with those young guys, to say, man, I've sat in that same seat. Yeah, I got a master's degree. I'm the director of this. And you guys can do it too. It was a powerful moment. But then the gym teacher, he switched it up though, right? We got all 8th grade boys, 40 of them to be exact. He asked them, how many of you guys think you'll live to see 30? And only one raised their hand. One. Right? Like that's the reality for some of our guys, because they can't see that far, because a lot of them are literally going day by day by day, right? 30 is like, that's on a whole other planet right now. And so we had that conversation, right? So this started out as a recruiting thing in admissions, but it was like, okay, well, this has to be a serious conversation. So why do you think that? And of course, out of that conversation was like, well, because, I'm surrounded by a lot of stuff, right? Like I'm a good guy, I'm in school every day, but, look where I live at. And, a lot of my elementary sits right behind, one of the notorious project buildings that has now been torn down. But, just to hear some of those guys talk about how they had to navigate, just 8th grade, you thought you were talking to 25, 30-year-olds, but these guys are 13 and 12. So when I think about this 8th grade quote, it's huge for a lot of our guys, because you think about kindergarten through 8th grade, that's a big foundation of knowledge. And if our guys haven't been, taught anything, or our young ladies haven't been taught from K through 8, and we're seeing those perceptions of us in the media, like what do we think some of our options are, right? So that made me think of that.
I think I'm going to ask you to stop telling me graduation years. I'm feeling old. But one of the things I like to comment on too is, I think the media drives perception of neighborhoods, and that leads to decisions. So when you close 50 schools and they're all on the south and west side, you're disinvesting in those communities. So I think when you look at the quote through that prism of kind of where's the investment in education, and I think one of the things that damages communities is you don't have those community anchors anymore. And a lot of those schools, whether you thought they were good or bad, had people who worked in them that were anchors in their community. And I think when you take those people out of the neighborhood, that causes more stress on a community and leads to a lot of other issues. And so we've seen that play out on the west side, like in the Austin community. I think Austin's down about 20,000 residents. And if you close the schools, do away with a lot of the anchors in the community, as faith kind of goes away and the anchor institutions of faith kind of also disappear, it's kind of, well, what's left? And when people find that there's nothing left, they move. And so I think that's one of the things that's, the media kind of creates this perception, and then kind of it becomes more and more reality as you see more and more people leave the city, and there's fewer and fewer resources in those communities to serve as anchors.
So could this quote that if there is more people graduating from high school, could this be applied to college for young men and women in these neighborhoods?
Well, I think when you look at the college statistics for
Right.
the city of Chicago, especially if you're African American, low income, Latino, low income, kind of your graduation rates, your opportunities to graduate from college are very small. And if you look at the economy today, that your opportunity for access and success is very small, and kind of your ability to support family starts to shrink without that access. So I think those numbers aren't exact, kind of, but I think it tells a story. Yeah.
I think we underestimate the value of locality. I think what I mean by that is people that we live amongst are huge influences beyond race, beyond economics, beyond anything. I always give this stupid example of, somebody asked me if I could win the Chicago Marathon. I said, well, yeah, maybe if I was Kenyan, whatever. But if next year, somebody from my block won the Chicago Marathon, I don't know why, it's not rational, but I believe, like, man, if I tried harder, I might be able to do it. And I think there's something to that. There's something to proximity. And so we'll ship in all these leaders, and they could even be, major successful African American leaders. And I think kids can still just yawn it off and go, well, if you look at my hood, you would be able to do that. And I think that's the problem. We don't have proximity. We have a lot of people that are willing to work in these neighborhoods. We don't have a lot of people that are going to live next to people and they can see life lived out. And that's how we all absorbed what we were able to do. I mean, if we'd never seen anybody doing what we were doing or something close to it, I don't think we would have the expectations that we have for ourselves. We absorb expectations. We don't get them off the media or whatever.
I agree with both.
Yep. One more topic to talk about, social influences. So here's the quote. I was in prison 27 years and 9 months, and I was formerly a street gang leader in this community. And then, not only that, I lost a son to the prison system. And because he grew up in this community and he was living up to the image I left out here, so it's directly affected him. So, I want to ask you, and Philip, you started talking about this, the influence of good or bad. How big of a role is a social influence, even like a mentor, someone to look up to? How big is this for the youth in these communities?
Depends on where they live. I mean, I think any mentor is a good mentor. I mean, anybody that's been in any time in anybody's life in any neighborhood is a good thing. But again, I'd refrain and say, like, it is the locality of those people. Seeing those people can do a million times. And I think if we weren't such hoarders, the middle class, and gave a little bit, like, are willing to live that. Hey, you can give a great home in Inglewood for $30,000 if you want to live in, but we'd rather be in a cramped studio, in Lincoln Park, and be complaining all day long how we have no space. But like, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I just say that, like, a life lived out. And that's how I'm trying to live my life. A life lived out, not special, not even that generous, just lived out in front of others is what's most important.
Credible resource is huge for our young men. For them to feel like they have someone they can go to, they can rely on, because a lot of our young men are in a situation where they've had a lot of people leave out of their lives. They have a lot of trust issues. So to be able to have a mentor, somebody they can rely on, someone they can call on, someone that's not just there, for the day or for the week, or there for personal gain, but somebody that's there for them. It's huge. I know we were talking about social emotional learning. That's implemented into our school day. Like, we have a 45-minute class specifically dealing with that every day, where our young men get to talk. They really create the curriculum for that. Like, man, today I got jumped by the police and it bothers me. I didn't say nothing the other day. I just, I had my head down, but I got beat up by the police and I'm angry and I want to talk to somebody about it. Or yesterday I saw my friend get shot and killed, and this is the third one, right? Like, so it's being able to have that space and to being able to have somebody that I feel like I can entrust that information. It's been huge for us, because like for the last 3 years at the Inglewood campus, I was the social emotional learning specialist, and so many positive, powerful moments came out of those guys feeling like they could just say and express themselves. Like, man, I want to talk about what I've been through, or I need to cry right now, and is that okay if I do that, right? And to create those spaces, it's been powerful. But definitely, our guys, they know who's there for them and who's not, right? Or so they're real protective of who they unveil it to, or who they entrust or bring in close. So because a lot of them are not coming from that traditional role model situation, because a lot of the guys they look up to are some of the guys that are have been bad beacons in the neighborhood, but of course they have the money, or they or they have the girl, or they look really nice, or they dress really well, but they might not be necessarily the best thing. So the role model situation can go either way, depending on what neighborhood it is, I believe.
Yeah, and I disagree slightly in terms of the proximity piece. I think that in an ideal world, you have in your house, your neighborhood, there's people there. But I've seen it through our work study program. I think our kids are very slow to trust, and I think the trust comes is like, when I fail, are you still going to be there? Or is this relationship only when I do everything that you think you want, like I live up to your expectations? But what happens when I screw up? Are you still going to be there, and are you still going to support me? And I've seen a lot of interesting relationships develop through our work study program. Like, our kids are downtown at law firms and banks, and some of the people that the kids connect with are very, very different from themselves, very, very, like, the one example I give is, like, one of our harder kids kind of to deal with connected about Star Trek with this, like, older white guy who's extremely, and like, this guy showed up at graduation. You saw them, you know, talking Star Trek to one another at graduation. And I think it's just the willingness of people to put themselves out there to connect and kind of, and I think for our kids, it's like, when I screw up, or when there's hiccups in my life, or when there's bad things and uncomfortable things I need to share with somebody, you're not going to be horrified and walk away from me when I share those things and tell you these stories. And when I look at that quote, I think that quote hits one of our students, one of our brightest kids last year, had like a 3.5, never has any demerits at school, no issues at school, and instead of going to college, he had a lot of college acceptances, he had good financial aid packages, but his dad said, no, you're coming to work with me on the street. And so he's kind of on the west side doing crap, who knows what, instead of going to college, because dad said, this is what we're doing. You know, this is our family, this is who we are, and this is the connections we have. And so you see a kid with so much potential. And you know, and our counselors, our principal, like, they keep calling him, like, hey, let's start next semester, and he's kind of like, nah, like, unless something happens to his dad, kind of like, that's where he's going to be, and he's at risk, you know, every day, kind of. And so, and I think when you see things like this, you know, that's reality for some of the kids, kind of, and kind of who's in their lives and who kind of influence their lives and which directions they go. So,
you bring up family support and the support system, and I want to bring up the topic of when people talk about that, they often mention poor family structure. But I don't want to just talk about that. I want to talk about things more upstream. What such structural or systemic influences do you think has an effect on these family structures, where some kids might be growing with a single parent, or maybe not, like, without both parents? They might be raised by the grandparents.
Well, working specifically with African American male boys, with our guys, 85% of our young men are the mothers, the head of the household. So a lot of them are seeking something, right? They're seeking that male mentorship, that companionship, and it's been very interesting to see how some of the guys are reaching out for that, right? Like, some of them act out on it, some of them express, like, man, I need a male mentor in my life, right? Mom has done an amazing job. You know, she raised me, she's helped me, but there's a significant piece that I need from, because I'm an African American male. I got beat up by the police officer, for being an African American male in the wrong place at the wrong time. When I get home, this is the conversation that we were having in class. I get home and, Mom tells me it's okay. She gives me a hug. She tells me she loves me, but she can't relate, right? Because she's not an African American male. And if I don't have anybody to bounce that off of, or somebody that can relate, or can feel what I'm talking about, then it creates a interesting thing, because most times what our young men do with that is store it, right? Like, okay, well, it's all right, it just happened once, right? But what happens when it keeps happening? And I don't feel like I can talk to anybody about those issues. And I think that's when we talk about that rage piece. Like, with our social emotional learning piece, for our guys, we're really big on trying to find our triggers. Like, what upsets us? What makes us angry? And if we can pinpoint that, we think that's pivotal to be able to say, okay, if we can teach that to each other, when your friends are having a conversation and it's getting out of hand, hey, big bro, hey, your pressure points, man, you get a little trigger right now. All right, let's talk about something else. All right, you know what, man, calm down a minute before it escalates, because right now in our society, right, it used to be a point in time where I could step on your shoes and, we might push and, argue, but we can come back to it, and that's not our reality anymore, right? Like, stepping on somebody's shoes in the wrong day, like, it can be something totally different. And a lot of time our guys don't know that they have this rage or this anger situation. And also too, you know, he's talking about the generational issues, right? Like dad, right? Like dad can't go against the grain because that's all he knows, right? So he would be more scared to let his young man go out to college. He's like, you know what, if the streets is 50-50, right? I know I've been through it, and if he dies with honor because he, you know, he's here, but he can't imagine sending him away to school because that scares him, because he can't fathom that because he didn't do it, right? Or he doesn't know how to. So it's that disconnecting piece that definitely sets the tone, because imagine what happens when he has, right, a son, right? And does he let him go? Or does he say, nah, you know, you follow in the family business, or, you know, vice versa. So I think one of the big things for us is trying to figure out how to break those norms and to push those extremes, like, man, why can't we go to school? Our dad, you know, me and you, me, dad, son, we need to all go to school, right? But a lot of times that's, you know, I mean, it sounds good, but I mean, it's a whole other world to be able to make that happen. So, you know, to hear that you guys are even, you know, calling still and reaching out, that's awesome. You know, and I know it feels good to even hear from him sometimes, you know, even if it's not saying like, okay, I'm enrolling next semester, but just to hear his voice, because those, you know, a lot of times, you know, our young men especially need that, to just know like, hey, I'm just checking on you. You know, I'm not judging you. I just, you know, we want to let you know that we're still here, and, you know, if you choose a different path, we want to be able to be here to support you.
And I think I would say even like the reason that we have this problem is I think we've got a lot of destruction of black families by structures in the city. I mean, like, talk about, you know, our judicial system destroying families, taking, you know, taking black men for ridiculous things, and separating them from their families for 10 years, you know, whatever, for some ridiculous crime that we're probably going to legalize in a year. You know, or just even just in you know, in entitlement programs that incentivize families breaking up, and that you know, really hurts poorer families. You know, and like all the setups where when you're in survival mode, like it's a chance between putting food on the table or not putting food on the table. Say, all right, you gotta move out of the house because we gotta get this. We gotta get this incentive. You know, there's a lot of things in there. I think they're disincentivizing close family units, and it's not because people just go, I don't want to have a close family unit. I want us to all be spread out, and that's why we're doing it in these neighborhoods. No. Like I think there's structures to incentivize.
I don't know if you need to really, I think the structures impact kids' education. I mean, not only the single parent households, the blended households, and kind of who's staying where, and kind of, it causes a lot of different issues just in terms of stability, and it impacts kids' ability to be successful, I think, on a lot of different levels. And I think there's a lot of causes that were mentioned there, and I think you see how it plays out on a lot of different levels and kind of the impact it has on kids.
Great. That was a great conversation. We have a few minutes left. I was wondering if the audience had any questions for our panelists.
Hi, I like that you used the ecological model in the previous slide. So I was just wondering, in your experience, your opinion, which level? So do you mind going to the slide?
Absolutely.
So like it had interpersonal, intrapersonal. What was it? Yeah, organization, all of that. So, in your opinion, on these levels, which level would be the most challenging for creating an intervention?
I would have to go with, and a great question too, by the way. I would have to go with individual, like negative, personal, like self-perceptions in Inglewood and North Lawndale and East Garfield Park. Like, man, you know, like an 8th grader would say, like, he doesn't think he'll live to see 30 though, right? Like, how do you get there? Like, what? A lot of times our young men have been told stuff so much and they have started to believe it, you know, not only to believe it, but by being able to visually see what they see every day. I think the biggest piece for us is just transforming our young men's minds, saying, okay, well, this is, you know, this is how we feel. And I was just telling, you know, I was just talking earlier, you know, about our young man that we had killed a few years ago by the name of Christopher Fields. And his story is so incredible, but freshman year, he wrote a poem about his death, right? And for a 13-year-old on the first day of school to write that I think I'm not gonna live to see 16 is mind-blowing. But it's even more mind-blowing the fact that he was so willing to still say, you know what, I think this is my reality, but I'm still going to step out on faith and try it anyway, right? Okay, you guys tell me that there is an alternate, I'll try it, right? Because he was open to want to be changed, but he just talked about, he didn't think it was possible because of what he sees every day and how he has to navigate. So, you know, it's really, the self piece is huge. And I think that's what made his death so hard on all of us, was the fact that he had figured out, you know, his passion. He figured out what he was good at. He was okay with, you know, with living now. It's like, okay, well, you know, this is what I'm good at. This is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna figure out how to make this work for me, and I'm gonna get out of my community. I'm gonna figure it out, and I'm gonna come back and impact change. And then, boom, he's killed. But that's a lot of hard work that goes into changing those self-perceptions, into building up those guys. The 13-year-old told me that I don't think I'm gonna live very long. I want to. I'm not opposed to living long, but I just don't think that's my reality.
I would probably say interpersonal, because I believe those personal relationships would be the ones that even help us change our self-perceptions too. But I think all of my solutions are the ones that I don't think are ever going to happen unless America goes through a lobotomy of culture. Until we begin to start thinking community, even if nobody with assets moves back to the communities, to move us all from a from kind of like a survivalistic mentality and saying, all right, let's start sharing what we have. You know, let's start thinking and get out of the false narrative also that police protect us. Police respond to crime. We in the neighborhood are the ones that like keep our blocks safe. Us banding together, us looking out for one another is what keeps ourselves safe. But that's really hard. You know, like when you feel like you're surviving, asking to give more to somebody else, I think is a big ask. Giving time, giving shared responsibility, meaning that kid on the block is my kid too. And that's hard to step out like that. And so I think like those interpersonal things are probably the most important, but probably the biggest ask of the people that are living.
I probably have, in terms of public policy, I think it's the hardest to accomplish. Just in terms, I think you can reach individual kids, I think it's difficult. But I look at the work we do in the neighborhood, and I was talking earlier to other people here, kind of how like our school is designed, we're built on the street, and that's intentional. And so we're built there so we can engage the community, we want to welcome the community in. And I think if you're it's kind of like the ladder. You have to start with the individual, then you kind of work with other people, then kind of your organization, then you kind of work with the broader community, and then you're able to impact public policy. But I think getting everybody consensus, especially when everyone's attention span is kind of your Twitter feed or very short and don't understand the nuance, I think coherent public policy that'll positively impact change, I think is very difficult. I think when I look at my job, like I can control what happens in my organization and kind of, and the kids in our building to a degree, but I think it's once you kind of, the further you step outside of what you're able to kind of control, I think it becomes more and more difficult.
Yeah, first, thanks for a really fantastic discussion, and thank you for sharing your experiences. I wanted to get your thoughts on the research collaborative. You think these are 5 well-resourced institutions full of really bright people, faculty of all kinds of expertise. And we actually had a lot of trouble getting people to work on this, right? There was lots of hesitation. Maybe you're an expert in the epidemiology of asthma, or community design, urban planning, you're a criminal justice person, but you weren't confident or capable or willing to kind of invest in this issue. And maybe that's a reflection of historical malpractice that research institutions have had with communities. We don't know how to do this in a thoughtful, nuanced, respectful way. Or maybe there's stigma around the issue because we want to get involved. So I guess I just wanted to see if you have any advice for our institutions and what kind of work you would have us do on gun violence.
I think that's where the relationship piece comes in. I think if those universities and other institutions are connected to the community, then people are willing to talk to you. I've only been at Christ the King for 6 years, and when they had the idea for the school and where they wanted to start the school, they were kind of like, hey, we're gonna do this great thing in your neighborhood, and people are like, well, who the hell are you? You know, kind of like, and it took people from the neighborhood to kind of make those introductions and kind of, so if you're not on the ground in the community doing something, people are going to look at you and kind of, and then the question they're asked is, are you going to be here in 3 months? The work's going to get hard, and it's not going to be an easy answer, So where are you gonna be in 3 months? Where are you gonna be in 6 months? And I think a lot of people who work in under-resourced community for a long time, there's a lot of people that come and say, hey, I'm here to help, and we got this great idea and this big project and all these different things. And it's kind of, you take an hour of your time, you take 2 hours of your time, and then 3 months later you haven't heard from them, and you're kind of like, hey, what's going on? And you're like, oh yeah, it got tough, you know, kind of. And I think if you're gonna make a serious investment in those communities and kind of build relationships, it can't be a short-term thing. And I think that's the trust issue you talk about with the kids. It's kind of, there's a lot of folks show up and say, hey, I'm here to help. And then the first time something goes sideways, they're like, that's it's too tough, you know, kind of. And this is a question, and like all those different things you mentioned are all linked, like the health issues in the neighborhood, like the economic issues in the neighborhood. It's all linked. It's kind of, and it has an impact with the gun violence. So it's not just this one issue. They're all interconnected in a lot of different ways. And so it's not a quick, easy, when people always ask, like, how do you solve gun violence? You kind of like, you know, like, this is real easy, you know, like, give me 30 seconds, I'll get this done for you. And I think it's those institutions willing to come into the neighborhood, establish a presence in the neighborhood, and stay connected to the community. And then there's people that are willing to work with each other. And I think the experience with the schools, we have great social service partners in our neighborhood. We have Build, which is a great community partner. We have Catholic Charities, which is a great community partner. And there's a lot of other smaller nonprofits as well that are willing to engage, and they got roots in the community, and so you know they're gonna be there, and you know someone's gonna pick up the phone when you need help, and then you're gonna do the same for them. And I think a lot of these institutions, like for our kids, like with Loyola and DePaul and these places, a lot of our kids have never been on their campus, you know, and it's 5 miles away or 4 miles away or 6 miles away, and kind of, so how do you connect with the community on a lot of different levels to say you're part of the community and you're gonna be there for long-term commitment?
Ditto everything. You say it's just gonna have to cost you something. Nobody wants to actually have something cost them. And you know, like we all have these bullshit detectors go off like all the time. Like whatever. Like you just want to feel good for 6 months or whatever. Like that you contributed something. I'm sorry, I'm not here for your ego build up. Like I don't have time for that. You know, because it happens all the time. But most people aren't willing to actually give up something that costs. And that's unfortunately what it takes.
Yeah, I think it definitely has to be intentional, and I think, you know, yeah, they gotta see it. You know, they gotta see. I mean, no one wants to, you know, talk to the stranger because they've done that already, right? Like I remember when I was like a 6th or 7th grader, you know, a group full of producers came to East Garfield Park, and they were like, man, we just want to show y'all, you know, this we're thinking about starting a show, and we want to show it to you, and you tell us if it reminds you of where you stay. And it was The Wire. I don't know if you guys seen The Wire, but before they showed The Wire, they came to East Garfield Park and asked us, was it accurate though, right? Now they originally told us it was, you know, man, we're gonna put you in it, right? Oh, we're gonna have this action film and it's gonna consist of you. But no, they wanted to make sure that, you know, even though that was in Baltimore and this is Chicago, like, man, this is an equivalent neighborhood, right? This is really what we're basing it off of. These kids know, like, man, let's show it to them. And a lot of stuff like that has happened, you know, like, I mean, we're good for the, like I said, if it bleeds, it leads, right? Like, we're good for a lot of the media stuff, you know, people come in, but like, you know, when the stuff gets hard, when it gets rough, when it gets long, you know, we back up a little bit. So definitely, like I was telling those guys, you know, however many of our young men you need, where you need them, they'll be there. And I think, you know, just being able to reflect and read this stuff is powerful, because on the day-to-day grind, like being a teacher in that building, attending some of those funerals, you know, having to cry with some of these kids sometimes about issues, you don't get to actually reflect on this, right? Because it's a day-to-day grind, right? Like, you know, if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But you don't really get to reflect or have that moment to be able to say, okay, let me put this piece of the puzzle here. So this gives me a reflective piece. What works for us? What doesn't work? What do we need to improve on? And what do we need to keep doing to impact growth and change? So we're open to it. We're excited about it. When you guys call, and like I said, when Dr. Dan called, I'm coming, you know, because he's a heavy, right, as they say in the Inglewood neighborhood. But you know, I was so interested in this because I'm like, man, this is an opportunity for us to be able to sit down and to you know, see what we need to do differently or what we need to do better.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time. If the panelists stay after for a minute, maybe answer a couple more questions. But I do want to conclude with a poem.
All right. So, like I told you guys a while back, 2014, one of my coworkers, you know, like every day, her tradition when she's starting a new class of freshmen, she always says, like, okay, You know, I know no one wants to get up and tell me their story, right? So I'm gonna ask you, when you open your door, right, when you turn the knob and you step onto the porch, what do you see? And after reading some of these stories, it was impactful and incredible. But this one story just stood out, and this is Christopher Fields. He entitled it Savage Land, right? This is a 13-year-old. Living life in a savage land, hopes and dreams thrown, accepting the fact that you'll die eventually and not sitting on the throne. Sleeping to gun sounds, screams and moans all around, hearing people who shot and bodies that drop. Now you see, that's my community. Streets, gangs, and guns. No worries though, because I'm immune to thee. My house is a safe place. Violence is what I want to be erased. A fear often comes by, whispering you'll die. He was killed 2 years after he wrote this. He would have graduated class of 2018. Probably one of the most impactful young men that I've ever met, because it let me know that every day our young men are in front of us. We have to be intentional. So I definitely appreciate you guys for the work that you guys are doing to try to figure this thing out, because from the ground root or from the scientific root, we're all in this together. But I think for me, he definitely put the lid on for me, like, okay, I gotta tighten up and get right, because literally this is a young man that killed 2 days into our summer vacation. But that story means something though, right? Like he was powerful because somebody spoke life into him, and even though he had this fear, he was still willing to step out on the ledge and say, okay, I'll try something different. Like I say, unfortunately, he just got caught in the crossfire and didn't make it. But his death will not be in vain, because that's why we go so hard. That's why we try to be intentional about what we do. So I just want you guys to think about that. Like that's somebody's view, right? Like he saw that every day. So again, we appreciate you guys. You guys impact change, and it's been a pleasure being on this panel with you guys as well. So thank you guys for what you do.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
I want to thank our panelists for coming here today. It was a great conversation. Thank you for everyone for attending. Great news, the fellowship will be continuing for year 2 this year, and we hope to continue the conversation. So thank you, everyone.